It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, I'm offering myself up as the sacrificial lamb. This hand is a pre-flop spot. It's a tough one from the final table of Unibet Poker's flagship weekly tournament, the SUPERNOVA. I think it's a hand that others might have played differently. I've certainly heard a lot of conflicting opinions from top players. I brought it to Dara almost immediately after, as I had that sinking feeling that I had done something wrong. I had, but I will admit I didn't realise how wrong it was. This was a costly mistake for me that I hope others can learn from. Dara, before we start the hand analysis, ICM on the final table is often extreme. Not as extreme as a satellite bubble, but certainly not altogether different either. I was 3 of 9 with about half the stack of first and second. What is good general ICM advice for people who find themselves in this spot on a final table?
Yeah, I think most people understand that ICM plays a role now, and what that means directly for your strategy is when you're getting it in, particularly against players who cover you, you need more than the actual price you're getting. So if you're getting all in against the chip leader and it's just you and him in the pot, you don't need 50% equity for it to be a correct to call. You need more. How much more is the difficult part? That's very, very difficult to work in game. In my experience, people greatly underestimate how much more equity they need. So in a spot where they're covered by chip leader, they think, okay, well, I don't need 50%, maybe I need 55%. But often it's a lot more than that. Often it's 60, 65, even 70%. The other thing to realize is that your ICM relative to other players is completely different. Your ICM against the chip leader is much more severe than it is against somebody you cover, for example. So against the chip leader, you might need 65, 70% equity to get in. Against somebody else, you might only need 52 or 53% if you cover them. Also, when you're the shortest stack, your ICM is lower. So the shortest stack might only need 55%, but the middle stacks are going to need a lot more.
Well, that is good general advice. Okay, to the hand. Ninth gets €464 and first gets €5,954. It's worth keeping that in mind. It's neither a steep nor flat payout structure. I'd say it's something roughly in the middle. Blinds are 6k, 12k with a 1500 ante. It is the second hand of the final table, so we've just merged together. Under the gun has 1.15 million. He opens to 26k. He's the chip leader. Under the gun 2, who has 1.1 million, he's the guy in second place, call. So already these are the big stacks getting involved. Action folds round to me in the hijack. I have 560k and I call with pocket queens. Now, this is the first decision point. There are 2 decision points in the hand, but they're both pre-flop. Dara, what do you make of my decision to flat here rather than squeeze with the hand? That is very squeezable in a lot of people's eyes.
Yeah, I like your decision to flat here. I would have done exactly the same. It's not always necessarily the most plus EV option, but it's certainly the lowest variance. When you're playing against, in this case, 2 players who cover you, it's okay to sacrifice a little bit of EV for variance. Also, it's not exactly a brilliant spot for you, even with queens, in that if you get it in against the chip leader or the other guy, you're probably ahead of the range, but you're not going to be miles ahead. And returning to what I said just now, you need so much more than just the 50% to get in against them that it won't be a good spot for you. So if you raise here and the chip leader shoves, it's a pretty gross spot for you. It wouldn't be immediately clear to me in game whether I'm supposed to fold or call. I guess I have to fold at that point. And, raising a hand as strong as queens and then folding it to a shove doesn't seem very appealing. So for that reason, I would call. I have a general fairly simplified strategy in these spots, these big ICM spots, where I just try to keep the pot as small as possible. So even with strong hands that I would normally, bump it up, I just flat and take it to the streets post flop.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth there. That was pretty much exactly my logic. I thought to myself, well, if I 3-bet here to 10x and I get shoved on or even re-raised, it's pretty much the ICM disaster I've been fearing. I take into account that by flatting here, I often will bring in the blinds, which means I could be playing a 5-way pot with queens. Okay, I'm under-repped and perhaps well disguised, but there's just going to be so many boards where it's a minefield. I have to tread so carefully. But at the very least, this pot has been kept relatively small. So if I do have to tread carefully, if I do have to maybe call 1 or 2 streets post, or maybe even find a value bet somewhere down the line, if I do manage to thin out the field, maybe come the river or something like that, I shouldn't be putting my whole stack in at any point in the hand.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you make a very good counterpoint too about, unfortunately, this is probably going to bring in the blinds and you're going to have to play a hand that doesn't play particularly well multi-way. That's why I was intrigued when you told me this hand. I gave you my initial impression, which was that I would also flat, but I was intrigued to see what the solvers would say in this spot. And we'll come back to that later. But obviously the advantage of raising in this spot is you will force out almost certainly the blinds at least, and you kind of define the hands a bit more strongly pre-flop.
Well, to continue with the action, right behind me, the cutoff, who has 230k, roughly 18 big blinds, shoves. Button folds, blinds get out of the way, and it gets round to the under the gun, who almost immediately shoves. 1.15 million total. Bear in mind, the guy right behind him pretty much has him covered. They've got very similar stacks. And I've obviously not got a small stack here. I've got 50 bigs or maybe just south of that. So that's a pretty strong play to just be willing to stick it all in there. But the timing tell is interesting, and that might be something I'll return to later in this discussion. Anyway, the under the gun 2 player does fold and it gets round to me. I haven't got much of a time bank to play with here. I would have loved a bit more time. It is almost fair to say in my mind that 10 seconds after I make my decision here, I regret it and immediately feel like I've made a mistake. And also slightly frustratingly felt like had I had 10 or 20 more seconds, I would have got to the right decision. I think in game, I end up making the call on the basis that 1, the timing tell made me feel like ace king is his hand a lot, and the squeezer's range is often very weak compared to my hand, and I am in very, very good shape to win a very large pot here and become the chip leader. The other factor there in my mind is that the other hands he might just shove quickly are probably jacks. Tens maybe at a push, probably not, but jacks feels about right. Queens would feel right too, only I obviously block queens. So in my mind I thought, well, if you have kings or aces in this spot, you might at least spend some time to think what's the best thing to do. Should you flat to call? All these different options he might have had. So in my mind I thought against a range of ace, king and jacks, I'm in pretty good shape there. Bear in mind here, I'm not factoring in the ICM enough, and this was my huge regret. I'm a satellite player like yourself, Dara. I've grinded heaps and heaps of satellites over the years. I'm used to these high ICM spots, and that's where my brain sort of told me I had done something wrong and why I wanted to come to you with it. I do make the call. Analyse this one for me.
First of all, on the timing tell, I think you picked that up very well. I did a webinar recently for live players moving to online, and the one thing I talked about in the tell area is these timing tells, which you can pick up online. The really fast bet is basically a hand that the player doesn't have to think about. It's a hand where they know the perfectly standard play is to shove it all in. So I would weight him very, very heavily towards ace king. I think almost every other hand, and you said you thought jacks might shove quickly. I'm not sure I agree on that. I think jacks might have to think about, is this strong enough to get in here or not? I'm not sure it's a snap shove for anybody in that spot. So I would certainly weight him very heavy towards ace king. I would discount aces for sure, because aces might think, maybe I should flat here and get the other guy in. Kings, I think, might be a quick shove as well. Kings might be like, well, this is too strong to fold. But on the other hand, I don't want to let ace X in either on the cheap. So I would definitely weight him very heavily towards ace king. When you said, first of all, about your decision to flat, I immediately agreed that I would do that. And the reason I gave is I don't want to get it in against the chip leader. When you then told me the action of shove and reshove, I said immediately, okay, now I fold, because I still don't want to get it in against the chip leader. But then you have a different perception of the chip leader's range that I would have. My perception would be it's nearly always ace king. It's sometimes kings. I wouldn't completely rule out aces. And to be honest, I wouldn't put too many other weaker hands into the range. So in my mind, we're not even in brilliant shape against that range. And we're certainly not getting the ICM premium that we need to get it in here.
Well, in the end, I do get the bad news. Under the gun has ace king. So that's kind of what we assumed. Believe it or not, cutoff actually had aces. So him blocking the ace king puts me in great shape, just hand against hand. But unfortunately, the king did come off on the turn and I was out in ninth for a bit of an ICM disaster. $450, give or take a few euro. And that wasn't really what I wanted. I probably came into the final table with, $2.5 grand of equity given my stack and position, and really putting myself in a spot where I can walk away with just that miserable payday is pretty terrible.
Yeah, I was interested to put this into the solver because I really wasn't sure whether we were better off flatting or 3-betting queens in the first place. I also ran it by a couple of top players. A shout out to the 2 jacks, Jack Hardcastle and Jack Sinclair. I'm going to put a caveat on the solvers, which is to say that the pre-flop solvers, like the one I use, HRC, they can only go down to ply 4. When the first player opens, that's ply 1. When the second player flats, that's ply 2. When you flat, that's ply 3. When the other guy shoves, that's ply 4. So now everything beyond that, it has to make gross simplifications. And actually, I had to simplify the analysis to try and reduce the number of plies. But it was pretty clear from the solver analysis that calling off a queens was not just a mistake, but a fairly major mistake. Roughly €350 in equity. I ran the hand by Jack Hardcastle, as I said. Jack immediately said he would do what the solver recommends, which is to 3-bet. And if you get shoved, unfold. The advantages of 3-betting over flatting essentially is that you do sort of clear out the field behind you. You define the ranges more strongly. The chip leader now needs an even stronger hand to continue. So even though it sucks to fold queens, having put a decent amount of chips into the pot, it's still sort of like the least bad option in this case. That said, when I looked at it in the solver, the EV between flatting and 3-betting was almost identical. Flatting makes us about €66 in the long term, and 3-betting it makes about €68. So I wouldn't actually mind sacrificing the €2 to reduce my variance in this spot and lose less chips when I am coolered. The other Jack I asked, Jack Sinclair, said he'd fist pump get it in, which didn't surprise me. Jack, of course, would, and he'd immediately spike his queen and go on to win the tournament, because that's the world Jack Sinclair lives in. Interestingly, Jack nailed the range of the chip leader's reshove exactly, and he still thought it was a call. So I think Jack is grossly underestimating how much the ICM is in this situation. Because I had to sort of do the hand from first principles, a lot of the analysis, I also did an ICM calculation on the situation. Basically, your stack, as you correctly said just now, is worth roughly €2,500 at this point. If you double up to the chip leader, your equity doesn't double. It doesn't go from 2,500 to 5,000. It only rises to just over 3,500. So you're risking 2,500 in equity to gain only 1,000. So therefore, you need to be a 72% favourite against his shoving range. And even if we start putting in lots of under pairs like jacks and tens into his range, you're never going to be a 72% favourite against the shoving range. So that's basically what makes it a fold. Even if we're ahead, we might be 55, 60% ahead of his range, but we're never 72%.
And how much can we factor in the plus EV spot I have against the third player, the short stack who shoved? Obviously, in this instance, I didn't have a better hand, but on balance, I will have a better hand than him. And those chips are obviously in a three-way pot, and they are mine too to be won.
Yeah, I think there are pluses and minuses, probably slightly more pluses by virtue of him being in there. You're obviously well ahead of his range with your queens. So you have like an overlay on equity. On the other hand, when you fold, there's an ICM benefit to that, and that he's now at risk of busting and you get to ladder and your equity will rise from 2,500 to 26 or 2,700 just by virtue of making the fold. So I think the two things kind of balance each other out. I do take your point though, that since his range is a lot weaker than yours, that's an additional incentive to call in this spot. But I think the ICM disaster of busting, basically losing your full 2.5k in equity to only gain just over a 1k is the overriding factor.
Yeah, that's certainly pretty extreme. And as I said, I sort of suspected this was going to be the bad news. What I didn't expect was how bad that bad news was. If I had to guess it, and I know I did guess it because I actually spoke to a few players about this too. Shout out here to Dara Davey and Dan Wilson. Dan pretty much nailed it as well. Actually, Dan's analysis was really tippy top on this one. But he felt like the continuing range was kings and aces. He similarly didn't think I was losing quite as much. I had guessed to him I would maybe lose about $100 in equity. I didn't think it would be in the region of 350, and that's obviously devastating.
Yeah, it is devastating. I mean, that's 3.5 buy-ins. I mean, it's a fairly significant chunk of your equity right now, given that you can probably pick up 100 in equity just by folding because of the ICM possibility of the other guy busting. Those spots are very, very difficult to get correct in game. And as I said at the very start, I think most people do underestimate just how extreme the ICM is. When you are sort of the mid-league stack and you're covered, that's the most extreme it gets. And to be honest, I wasn't surprised to see 72% was the break-even point. I would have guessed it at around 70%. Even in non-satellites, you do see ICM premiums that extreme on final tables when middle stack is facing off against a big stack. And that's what makes these situations so difficult to play. If you need 72% equity to get it in.
And speaking to that, had I had kings, it was a legitimate get-in, but it's not printing.
It absolutely isn't printing. Kings makes less than a tenner as a get-in, which is frightening when you think about it. I personally wouldn't have ever considered for a minute folding kings, but it's actually a lot closer than I thought. I assumed it was a fist pump get-in. It's actually just a like, meh, okay, I'm making a tenner here, so I have to get it in.
Sick. Well, listen, Dara, I really appreciate you taking a deep, deep look into this one, getting the solvers involved, getting all those human solvers involved as well. I do appreciate all the feedback from all the players who've been pestered about this one. It preyed on my mind, and I thought it might make for a good strategy piece, because I suppose I always focus on these situations where big mistakes can be made, but they're makeable by a lot of players. So if we can all collectively learn from my mistake here, maybe we can all save a few bob, where a lot of time when we look at close spots that are sort of hand analysis worthy, they end up being so close that actually the wrong decision isn't worth that much money. In this case, it seemed like the kind of mistake a lot of people would make, but was actually worth a lot.
Yeah, ICM is really extreme in these situations and it's very, very unforgiving. Like you're only one pip below the hand that you're supposed to call with, but it's still a huge mistake. The biggest mistake you can make at the start of the tournament, even if you give away 100% of your stack, is one buy-in. This is 3.5 buy-ins. This is why it's so important to focus your study on these sort of spots, because this is where the big equity is won and lost in tournaments. And these are very difficult spots. These are the kind of spots you really have to run a lot of sims and look at a lot of situations to get an intuitive sense. I think the vast majority of players listening to this, I suspect, are thinking like, what, queens? Of course you're getting it in. Or at least that was their initial reaction to the hand. So I think it will be a surprise to a lot of people just how big a mistake it is to get queens in here.
Indeed it was. Well, out I went with my €464. Not the payday I had been hoping for, but at least I've gotten this valuable lesson. And as you pointed out to me, Dara, there's some chip race strategy segment equity even when I make a bollocks or something.
Yeah, well played, David. If you played this hand perfectly, we'd have nothing to talk about. And pre-flop ICM spots, really good, tricky ones like this, are actually hard to find. Most of the spots are fairly routine. This was a really, really gross spot where even some very good players that we spoke to got it wrong. So I think there's a lot of usefulness for our listeners to think about a spot like this.
Indeed there is. Well, thank you very much once again, Dara O'Kearney.
Thank you.